All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to call this meeting of the Transportation Committee to order. As a reminder, this meeting is being shared virtually through Zoom for those who couldn't join us in person and is being recorded. Committee members, please remember to turn in your microphones so that those online in the room can hear you, and please state your name before speaking as well. I'd like to go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. I'll start. Kevin Carrier, representing Lake County.
Tara Orban, representing Cook County.
Amy Lee, representing CMAP.
Mary Nickel with CDOT.
Heidi Lichtenberger, representing Kendall County.
Scott Hennings, representing McHenry County.
Kyle Whitehead, RTA.
Morning, Jackie Forbes, Kane County.
Good morning, John Paul Deepla, FHWA.
Steve Travia, DuPage County.
Tom Vanderwood with the Northwest Indiana Regional Planning Commission.
Chris Hebert with the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission.
Eric Luan with PACE.
Jack Cruikshank, Illinois EPA.
Lynette Civarella, Metra.
Good morning. Happy holidays. Leon Rockingham, Mayor of the City of North Chicago.
Pam Jones, Center for Neighborhood Technology.
Thomas Vimonte subbing for Audrey at MPC. She sends her best from Spain.
Steve Schilke, IDOT Region 1.
Brandon Gaber, IDOT Planning and Programming.
Doug Ferguson, CMAP.
All right, moving to the audience now.
In person, we have John Hosma, CMAP.
Terry Dixon, CMAP.
John Loper, DuPage County.
Brian Larson, North Shore Council of Mayors.
Drew Duffin, McHenry County Council of Mayors.
Eric Tornado, Northwest Council of Mayors.
Mike Clemens, Lake County.
Joe Serdam, Lake County.
Matt Pasquini, DuPage Council of Mayors.
Cam Dobbs, CMAP staff.
Martin Menninger, CMAP.
Ryan Tomto, CMAP.
Jen Miller, CMAP.
Alex Beata, CMAP.
Richard Norwood, CMAP. Mike Sopchik, CMAP.
Brett Brown, CMAP.
Sarah Stolpe, CMAP.
Blanca Bella Schneider, same.
George Rivera, CMAP.
Vicky Barrett, CMAP.
Sorry, came in. Anyone online?
Jennifer Henry, CTA.
Sarah Fiorito, City of Evanston.
Thanks, guys. I'll do everybody. We've got Aspen Walters, Bill Barnes, Christina Kukowski, Dawn Dina, Garland Armstrong, George Candathil, Gretchen Klock, Jamie Jackson, Jane Grover, Jenny Vanna, Jennifer Henry, Jesse Altman, John Carpenter, Julie Reschke, Caitlin Cernak, Carly Casado, Karen Robles, Lee Overholzer, Leslie Rower, Mark Kane, Matt Marth, Megan Swanson, Mike Vanderhoff, Noah Harris, Sarah Fiorito, Vaspa Boykowski, and that's it.
All right. Thank you, Kama, and again, welcome everyone. Before we begin, we do have a procedural matter to take care of, and that's with voting members who qualified to participate remotely. Karen Robles with the Illinois Tollway and Christina Kupkowski with Will County have requested to participate remotely in compliance with the requirements of the Illinois Open Meetings Act. A vote of those present is required to allow their participation. So do I have a motion to allow the remote participation?
So moved.
Mayor, yep. Seconds, all those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Moving on, item 2, agenda changes and announcements. Real quick, I do want to just acknowledge we do have Steve Travia here today with DuPage County, Director of Transportation, previously from IDOT, but this is his first time at the table for TC representing DuPage County. So welcome, Steve. I don't have any agenda changes. Do we have any other announcements from committee members? Yes, Jackie.
Good morning. I realized at our last meeting that I attended, I neglected to announce that we have opened our Long Meadow Parkway Corridor project. This is over $200 million project. We built a new bridge over the Fox River and it made improvements to an entire corridor as part of that. New multi-use path connecting to Forest Preserve. So we're really proud of that project to have brought that to fruition. As we say around KDOT, this is the second once-in-a-lifetime project that we've completed in the last 10 years or so. So we're excited to have that open. A smaller project that we also opened recently was our Doberman Road Extension project. This is where we built two bridges, one over US 30 and the other over the Burlington Northern Santa Fe tracks. It was a pretty big safety issue in the area as trains were blocking the only crossing in the area. So people in the Big Rock area could not get over the train tracks, including first responders. So now instead of having to drive 20 minutes out of their way, they are able to just go a couple minutes down the road and go over the tracks at this point. So wanted to make those announcements. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jackie, and kudos. I know a lot of hard work went into both of those, so great job.
Oh, and I should also mention that it opened, the Longmeadow Tollway was not a tollway. It was, it's free thanks to the Illinois General Assembly, our friends in McHenry County, and our friends at Cook County. So thank you for your financial support on that, because we had planned that to be a toll bridge and it is not.
Awesome. Thank you, Jackie. Any other comments from committee members? All right, moving on, item 3.0, we have approval of the minutes. We have before us the draft minutes from our November 22nd meeting. Do I have a motion to approve those minutes as presented? CMAP, motion. Do I have a second? Second, Mayor Rockingham. Any discussion on the minutes before we approve? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Moving on to item 4.0, CMAP updates, and Amy is with us this morning to give us an update on CMAP agency and board activities. Morning, Amy.
Good morning. Thank you, and welcome to you all here for the December meeting of the Transportation Committee. I'm happy to share some updates as usual from CMAP team as we close out a very busy and productive year. First, just as good planners do, we are already planning for the committee's agendas for next year. As a reminder, if there are topics you'd like for us to discuss, please reach out to me, let me know so we can incorporate that into our planning for next year. Next, CMAP has been busy, not just on a regional scale, but globally too. Our region, as you know, is a global city and is known as a global destination for both business and pleasure. So to maintain our region's global prominence, it's important that we continue to learn from our peers, even from those abroad. So last week, to that end, CMAP Executive Director Aaron Alleman joined a delegation of leaders from our region to visit Munich and Berlin in Germany. The delegation included transportation and environmental advocates, labor leaders, and members of our state General Assembly, including Senator Ram Vilibalam and Representative Evadina Delgado, who sponsored the legislation that led to the PART report. Some pictures up here for you all to enjoy. For those of you who got knee-deep into researching transit governance, so hopefully that's not too many, but I was one of them, you'll know that the German model of transit governance came up during the PART process as a good and relevant model for our region to consider. During the delegation's trip, they met with German transit officials to learn more about the management of their system. They also spent some time experiencing the system firsthand as customers. In other far-flung places in the world, our very own Vicki Barrett attended the first World Street Congress last week, which was hosted by Chicago's sister city, Osaka, Japan. The purpose of this event was to share best practices and challenges in creating people-centered spaces on our city streets. The event included both public sector and private sector organizations. Another participant from our region was Kimberly Bears, who's the president and CEO of the Magnificent Mile Association. Then bringing it back home here, CMAP, our work leading the Safe Travel for All region-wide safety initiative continues. The team is actively promoting online engagement for all 6 participating counties. That's Cook, DuPage, Kane, Lake, McHenry, and Will, where incentives are being offered for input. So just as a reminder, the Safe Streets for All program really emphasizes broad input from the public. Historically, safety priorities generally stem from, prioritization from technical experts, engineers. The emphasis of this program is to broaden that and to help us understand safety issues experienced by users on a daily basis. So, so far the team has collected more than 2,500 safety concern locations from more than 1,100 people. We greatly appreciate continued support in getting the word out about this public input opportunity. On the technical assistance front, CMAP was thrilled to be part of the Austin Coming Together 2024 Membership Awards. CMAP and the Urban Land Institute Chicago were recognized for our collaborative work on the Central Avenue redevelopment project, which we recently completed. We're honored to be recognized and look forward to those recommendations being implemented. Switching to the legislative front, CMAP's Intergovernmental Affairs team is gearing up for a robust legislative session in January, with funding for our region's transit system being a top priority. CMAP will continue engaging with the General Assembly as needed to offer up input as ongoing discussions proceed. Additionally, CMAP will actively seek an appropriation to fund work laid out in the Regional Planning Act. This is the act that established CMAP back in 2005. And some of you may know when CMAP was enacted, at the time the General Assembly did not allocate funding to support our non-transportation work. So you'll see that, excuse me, in our legislative agenda. As a reminder, after CMAP board in January meets, we will then have our Intergovernmental Affairs come before this committee to present to you the 2025-26 advocacy agenda that CMAP would like to move forward on. Okay, just rounding out here. One more reminder that last month, so in November, CMAP sent annual invoices to our counties, municipalities, and transportation partners for local dues. The dues are due in January. If you have any questions, like where did you send the invoice to and things like that, please let me know. I'm glad to help follow up with you on that. Thank you again in advance for your support. And finally, as we roll into the holidays, I and the entire CMAP team would like to extend sincere gratitude to all of you around the table for another year of invaluable collaboration. At this point in time, I want to extend a very special thank you to CNT. CNT has been at this table since, and I think before the inception of CMAP. I didn't have time to fact check that, so I just wanted to, it's been a long time that CMAP has been a good partner. And so it comes with great sadness that I share that CNT has indicated that this will be their last TC meeting due to competing obligations that have them very busy at the local and national level. CMAP staff will be developing a recommendation for how to backfill this seat. We hope that whoever the new voice will be, that they will be as effective as CNT has been in rounding out the voices that need to be heard in our region and bringing regional mindedness that helps us achieve valuable consensus. So with that, just again, thank you to you all. Thank you to CNT. We hope you have a happy holiday season. With that, I'll turn things back over to Kevin.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Amy. Those are good updates. We appreciate that. And just one note, especially for those online, that Karen Bader is here in person now from the CTA. So just letting you know that. Moving on to our approval items, item 5.01. We have before us the proposed 2025 meeting dates for this committee. We saw drafts of these last month, so we're here to approve them today. Do I have a motion for approval? Jack, I got a motion, a second?
Second, Cook County.
From Cook. Motion a second, and any discussion on the 2025 meeting dates before we approve? Yes.
Just a recommendation, if it's possible, to move the December 19th meeting back a week. We're, as everyone knows, we're at the day before probably one of the busiest travel holidays of the year. If it would work with everyone's schedule, just a quick proposal. But if we're too late in the process, I understand.
Looking around here, I do know that this is kind of tied to all the approvals and stuff. I don't know if it's able to do it on the floor or not, but.
Yeah, I'm wondering, does this impact like tip conformity analysis? I know the deadlines are set based off of like, this sets a IDOT local roads letting schedule for local agencies, and my knee-jerk reaction is that perhaps this would impact it.
Terry's coming up for a comment.
We can look at the schedules and we can get back to you guys at the next meeting about if we can move it or not.
Okay, procedurally, who wanna
Still vote on it. Like, I mean,
still vote on it and just take that as a comment and maybe,
Right. This is just purely, I mean, everything is subject to change.
Okay.
So.
okay. Yeah, so we can amend it later or just take that into consideration. So if you're fine with that, we'll.
And I'm always the one fussing at people. We can like accept it as is for now. And if at the next meeting we need to pivot because we can change the date, then we can bring that back for you.
We're
Yeah.
comfortable with that, just a recommendation.
Yep.
For everyone traveling today.
Yep. No, appreciate that, Brandon. So we'll go through the approval process here, and then as Terry mentioned, if it needs to be amended in the future, we'll just bring that back through a future meeting. So any other comments or questions? All right, I think we have a motion and a second. So all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. All right, item 5.02, we got John Hodsmith with us today to provide an overview of the fiscal year 2023 through 2028 Transportation Improvement Program amendments. Good morning, John.
Good morning, and my name is John Hodsma. I'm filling in for Russell today. So getting right into it, included in your packet is a memo detailing the 101 tip changes contained in formal tip amendment 25-04 and the 109 tip changes contained in administrative amendment 25-04.1 and 25-04.2. As outlined in the memo, formal amendments resulted in an increase of $1.04 billion in total project costs for all prior, current, and future years. A few highlights contained in this amendment include IDOT adding about $185 million in federal funds, including $90 million from a mega grant to begin moving forward on work in the I-290 corridor, specifically at Illinois 171 and 5th Street. IDOT also added $54 million in federal funds for the I-80 bridge over the Des Plaines River, and both of these IDOT projects are RSPs on to 2050. And then lastly, and by far the most significant changes were made by Metro, which added nearly $650 million, $288 million of that being in federal funds to the TIP, and much of this is in the later years of the TIP, so that's federal fiscal year 28 and 29, to continue various rail station and track improvements throughout the system. And then moving to the administrative amendments, these changes added $22.8 million to the TIP in all prior, current, and future years. And combined, the net change for total cost in the TIP from all amendments resulted in $1.064 billion being added to the TIP in prior, current, and future years. As shown in the memo, cost changes comprise most of the formal changes, while administrative amendments were primarily AC and ACC changes and cost changes. And accounting for the amendments presented to you today, the TIP remains fiscally constrained. The amendments, along with the memo, were posted on December 13th for committee and public review, and approval of formal TIP Amendment 25-04 is requested.
All right, thanks, John, for that update. Before we get to any discussion, I'll entertain a motion to approve TIP Amendment 24-04. All right, motion, second. Thank you, Lynette. Any questions or discussion today for John? All right, seeing none. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, John. All right. Kama's here with us for item 5.03. She's going to present on to 2050, 2025 through 2029 TIP conformity analysis and TIP amendment.
I'm the second pinch hitter for Russell here today. So according to Russell, included in your packet today is the ONTO 2050, 23 through 2028 TIP conformity amendment 25-03. The CMAP region is a non-attainment area for ozone. Thus, we are required under the Clean Air Act to demonstrate that projects in the TIP conform to the motor vehicle emissions budget for our area through a regional emissions analysis. Specifically, projects in the TIP subject to air quality analysis requirements demonstrate when modeled that the region does not exceed our budgets as shown at the end of the memo in your packet. I want to highlight that the emissions modeling was done using a new US EPA model called MOVES 4. MOVES 4 has several enhancements and accounts for new finalized rules such as the EPA heavy-duty low NOx, NOx being nitrous oxide rule for model years 2027 and later. The impacts of these rules, particularly the low NOx rule, resulted in a significant reduction in modeled emissions after 2030 that continued through 2050, which is the last year that we model. Using MOVES 4 also enabled CMAP to model the impacts of electric vehicles in the near and long term in a way that CMAP has not been able to do with previous models. MOVES 4 is only modeling on-road transportation emissions, so electrical generation is not part of this analysis, but we're excited that we were able to capture the impacts of EVs as part of the vehicle fleet mix in a much more robust way. The conformity memo, CMAP's modeling approach, and the impacts of MOVES 4 were discussed at a recent Tier 2 interagency consultation meeting. The members of this group expressed support for how CMAP is going about the emissions modeling and conformity process. The memo and list of projects included on the conformity amendment was released for a 30-day public comment period, and no comments were received. Therefore, at this time, staff requests approval for recommending the ONTO 2050, 2023 through 2028 TIP conformity analysis and TIP conformity amendment 25-03 to the MPO Policy Committee.
And that's a mouthful. Thank you, Kama. All right. Before we have a discussion, I'll entertain a motion to approve. I don't think I can just say what Kama just said, right? I have to repeat it again. So the 2025 through 2029 TIP conformity analysis and amendment. Do we have a motion? Jack, awesome. Second. Thank you. Any discussion or questions? Yes, Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thomas Vimonti from MPC. We raised two issues on two of the items. I want to acknowledge CMAP staff responding quickly, and so one is resolved. There's one issue on TIP ID 09240032. It's the Commons Drive project. MPC has questions outstanding about whether some suboptimal, probably ADA non-compliant bus stops are going to be improved as part of that project. That question is pending. I don't know if staff has any update or Kane County. And
Yeah, so CMAP reached out to us this morning. So I did a quick look when I got here at the project. It's one of our new projects that just were funded. They have not started phase 1 engineering yet. So that's starting in 25, construction's in 2029. So we'll reach out to the city. They are known for being cognizant of ADA improvements and those type of situations. So we will ask them specifically about this project and if they're going to address those was it 3 different PACE bus stops that you had pointed out that would need to be connected better than they are now. They really have no connection now, as you pointed out. So yeah, I'll look into that for you and we'll get back to you and let you know. If for some reason they're not in there, we'll strongly encourage them to add those. But I noticed that they did put ADA improvements as part of the project scope. So.
Awesome. I think Tara had a
Yeah, just another response to that question. Just procedurally, though, the TIP and the conformity analysis that we're doing is just so that preliminary engineering can get started. So the optimal time to provide that input and comment would be in, what did you say, 2027, when preliminary engineering is started. There is part of the NEPA process, because these projects are receiving an infusion of federal funds, the NEPA process does allow for a period of public input, just as we are on this TIP. So if it is a project where there's a strong desire from MPC, I think we could also encourage MPC to participate in those project-specific meetings to ensure that those needs get addressed as part of the project.
Great. Tom Smont, MPC, thank you for that. And we are very interested in making sure that when there are bus stop improvements that should be made for ADA compliance or other reasons, that they're built into the projects we do in this region. So thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments on this item? Seeing none, we got a motion and a second. So all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Kama. Well, Kama's staying with us. So moving on to item 5.04. Kama is going to explain to us and present the fiscal year 2026 Unified Work Program budget allocations.
All right, thank you again, Kevin. Before I dive into the recommendations contained in the memo in your packets today, I just wanted to take a minute or two for a quick refresher and overview on what the UWP is and how its development has evolved in recent years. The Unified Work Program, you could go to the next slide, is a requirement for documenting the work plan and budget for the transportation planning activities that are the responsibility of the MPO. The UWP is an important component of CMAP's comprehensive budget because it contains the federal metropolitan planning funds apportioned to our region. CMAP also conducts other planning activities, not just transportation planning, using other fund sources that are documented in the CMAP comprehensive budget, but not included in the UWP. CMAP also relies on our planning partners in the region to assist with accomplishing the work plan and allocates funding to those partners through the UWP. In 2023, CMAP's UWP committee approved a methodology for the allocation of UWP funding. That methodology includes two components: a core program that consists of activities and tasks to meet federal requirements, and a competitive program that consists of other transportation planning activities that support federal, state, and local planning priorities for transportation. Within that methodology, the core program is an annual program developed by soliciting budget proposals from our eligible planning partners for ongoing core activities only. Those proposals are reviewed by staff for reasonableness, and every effort is made to accommodate the request to ensure that all MPO requirements for the region are accomplished in a cooperative and cost-effective manner. So this cycle, as detailed in your packet memo and shown here, we received budget requests for core activities from 16 agencies, including CDOT, the 11 councils of mayors, which are rolled up as COM on this slide, CTA, the McHenry County DOT, METRA, and PACE. Staff did work with individual agencies, including a couple of the councils, CDOT and METRA, to make minor revisions that had little or no impact on the bottom line amounts of funding requested. We also worked with CTA to make some adjustments to the staff hours they proposed to ensure that individual staff were not budgeted for more hours than they could possibly work within a year, as well as to bring the overall request into closer alignment with the rest of the submittals. The resulting recommended core program for external agencies for fiscal year 2026 is $5.7 million. The second component of the UWP is the competitive program, which is a 5-year program developed biannually, every 2 years, by soliciting for one-time projects that are scored competitively using criteria established in the methodology. The first 5-year program was established last year for projects to be implemented in fiscal years 2025 through 2029. Next year, we'll be soliciting again for additional projects, and that 5-year period will shift to cover fiscal years 2027 through 2031. As shown here in the highlighted column, the competitive program projects approved last year for fiscal year 2026 totaled just under $1.1 million. So when combined, the total allocation of FY 2026 UWP funds to external agencies is $6.7 million, which is a little less than a 12% increase over what was awarded to external agencies in fiscal year 2025. This left $27.5 million to be utilized by CMAP for MPO activities and operations. This is a little bit less than a 3% decrease from fiscal year 2025, but is more than adequate for CMAP's operating budget. At this time, CMAP's comprehensive budget is still under development. Therefore, we haven't yet allocated these $27 million in funds to specific activities, which is why we see TBD on this slide for CMAP personnel and expenses, as well as TBD on the more detailed table in your memo for the individual activities. The CMAP board is scheduled to discuss the agency work plan in January and take action on the comprehensive budget in February. As those discussions progress, we'll be able to fill in those missing details in the UWP. So therefore, at this time, staff is requesting your approval and a recommendation to the MPO Policy Committee to include the proposed funding allocations into the FY26 UWP. The allocations will be presented to the MPO for approval in January, and then should the CMAP comprehensive budget result in any proposed changes to those allocations, those would be brought back to the MPO in March.
All right, thank you, Kama. And you may have said this too, but I believe this went through UWP committee and they voted to recommend it too. There's a lot of robust discussion as well down there, and they brought it forward to us, right? So it's gone through.
Yeah, so the methodology they approved last year actually makes the budgeting exercise a staff exercise, but we did present our recommendation, which is what's shown here, to that committee for any comments or concerns that they had. There was a discussion, there were no comments or concerns, so it's coming to you as it went to them.
Awesome. Thank you, Kama. All right, I will entertain a motion to approve the fiscal year 26 UWP budget allocations.
So moved.
Chuck. All right, do I have a second? Scott, all right. Any questions, comments, discussion for us today? Seeing none, all those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, Kama.
Thank you and
Appreciate it.
happy holidays, everyone.
All right, moving on to item 5.05. This is our last approval item for this morning. Martin will provide us with an overview of the 2026 highway asset condition targets, which are detailed in the agenda packet you received. And just so you know, you have Tara and Mai's vote for the best dress today. That's pretty awesome, Sue.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. So going to talk about highway asset condition targets today. That's bridges and pavement, but hoping to have sort of a more general conversation about system preservation and asset condition. Next slide. So first, we'll talk about the bridges and pavement. But really, I'd like to have a larger discussion about how we set our future targets. I've got a few discussion questions for you there. I'll provide a quick update on our dashboards that I introduced in August, and then talk about next steps. Next slide. So why are we talking about these today? Specifically, we are required to. We are in our second performance reporting period. Our first one started in 2018. The second one starting in 2022. As part of that, IDOT sets 2- and 4-year targets. MPOs set 4-year targets back in 2022. There is an opportunity to sort of fine-tune those targets after 2 years. IDOT did that and sent them to us in October, which prompts us 180 days to either support their targets or adopt our own. So that's sort of a framework of where we are at now. Next slide. So first, we're going to talk about pavement targets. Pavement targets, we initially set in 2018 based on the data available. Since then, new data has come out that includes cracking and rutting. With that, we adjusted our targets in 2021 to support the state targets, partially because there's not a lot of trend data on pavement with the new measures, and we don't have a strong financial tool to sort of analyze pavement, or didn't have a strong tool. So if you go to the next slide, we are again recommending supporting IDOT's pavement targets like we did in 2021. They made a few adjustments. They set these targets based on anticipated investments and their budgets in the system. Just a small 1% tweak to % in good condition for interstates. They have historically set a 1% in poor condition target for interstates, but reliably been below that. So this is, how many potholes do you want on the interstate? We want this number to be pretty low. So they've adjusted that down to 0.5 for interstates. Based on their planned investments, they think their non-interstate targets are reasonable and propose no changes on those. Just a reminder, these are all the national highway system is what this measure applies to. So with that, I'm gonna move on to bridges. So our bridge targets, we have much better data going back to 1992. We originally set those targets in 2018. And if you go to the next slide, at that time, we are about 8.5% in poor condition. We've gotten worse since then. When we set our target, we said we want to do our best to just maintain the existing condition. There is a federal goal of having less than 10% of bridges in poor condition. Next slide. One of the major issues with bridges right now is we've got this huge share of our bridges that were built sort of post-World War II, baby boom of bridges. Bridges are categorized by bridge deck area. So a lot of our interstates were built during this time. Those have much more deck area, some of our biggest bridges. But a lot of those bridges are reaching their retirement age. If not retirement, they're at least starting to show their age, let's say. And so we have an uphill battle in this region to maintain those bridges. And more of them are going to be coming due for replacement, which is why improving the condition of our bridges is going to be very difficult. The average, and without a major bridge building boom, which maybe they have in Kane County, but the average age of our bridges is just going to continue to climb. And so maintaining our asset condition on bridges continues to be a very ambitious target. With that, next slide. Our bridge targets, again, based on those original baseline in 2017 of just trying to do our best to maintain condition. In general, the condition has been getting a little bit worse, but we think this goal of trying to keep our bridges generally in good condition and below that federal goal continues to be a reasonable goal. With that, I'll pause for questions on bridge and pavement conditions before moving on to talk about how we might do this in the future.
All right, do you want to discussion the vote and stuff here? Yeah. All right, so let's get, Martin's got a couple slides after this, but now he'd like to get the vote going for this topic and have the discussion, then he'll give us a couple more slides after that. So I guess I'll start by entertaining a motion to approve the 2026 highway asset condition targets. Got Mayor. A second. Brendan. All right. Any questions, discussion topics or items for the group or Brandon or Martin today? Yes, Tara.
Thank you for your presentation, Martin. Question about the bridge condition. When we're looking at the system of bridges, I know there's a couple different ways to look at it. There's the asset condition, and then oftentimes we talk about bridges being functionally obsolete, where the lanes are narrow. It might be beautiful and in fine condition, but it doesn't have the shoulder width, for example, or the sidewalks that would be needed in what we would build today. How much of that like functional obsolescence, if any, is built into this? Or is this looking strictly at the condition of the superstructure, substructure, and so forth?
Yeah, the federal measure is purely looking at structural issues, not functional issues.
Okay, so that's the structural sufficiency rating, takes that into account, and
it's
that's not what this is.
superstructure, substructure, deck condition. Take the lowest of those three numbers, and that's your bridge's rating. And then you look at the area of the lanes times the length to get the area and sum all that up.
Yes,
So,
appreciate that clarification. Was just very curious if that factored into this condition, which it sounds like it didn't. Thank you.
All right, yes, Thomas.
You want to get your, there you go.
A real difference in pavement condition between the interstate and non-interstate. And I wonder what are the consequences in terms of minimizing life cycle repair cost for all of our NHS roadways when we have this big difference? Interstates seem to be in really great condition. Non-interstates have much more in fair and poor. And does that mean that we're not perhaps spending our repair and maintenance dollars most efficiently by having that difference, or is that difference intentional and actually efficient?
There might be better people in this room to answer your exact question, but I'll give it a first go and see if somebody else wants to jump in and save me. I will say, in our original 2050 plan, one thing we were really pushing is sort of a systematic preventative maintenance approach to system preservation. Some of the components of that are collecting more data and more detailed data more regularly and having asset management systems. So since then, IDOT has developed an asset management system for bridges and pavement, and we've worked with a number of municipalities to develop local pavement asset management plans and use our tool called Paver that sort of does this financial analysis of preventative maintenance versus reconstruction and when the optimal time to do treatments to bridges and pavement are. So I would say that there are tools being used to sort of optimize the financial return on our investments, but I'm not sure how interstates versus non-interstates, how that decision is different in a sense. I know that at higher speeds, a pothole is a bigger problem. And so we set higher goals for the interstate for that reason. I don't know, partially answers your question.
I do think it's the difference is noteworthy, and like I say, I just wonder if it's somehow intentional and why our non-interstate NHS roadways are not meeting our interstate standards. So I'll leave it at that.
I can ask maybe a question too, and Tara's going to jump in. Can you maybe help define, on that slide we had, it's similar to this one, I guess. We had for the roads, it was NHS and then non-NHS. Is non-NHS everything else, like township, local roads, municipal roads, county roads, or?
For pavement, it's interstate and non-interstate. All of our targets are for the NHS. So all federal targets really just apply to the federal system. But we distinguish between interstate and non-interstate. So
Okay, so all NHS routes. Okay.
So point of clarification then, though, the National Highway System, Steve Travie, I'm looking at you. That includes arterials and local system assets. So Thomas, to your question, the state of Illinois has jurisdiction and maintenance responsibility for high volume, high traffic, high distance travel. They also have funding for that. It's a different bucket altogether. I'm hoping you give me a nod, Steve. That like the non-interstate NHS is like this whole part of the table. It's it's state system and local. Is that right?
So I'm gonna, much like the CMAP comment here, I will let OP&P bail me out here in a second. But basically, to answer the original question, what you're talking about is going to get down to the functional classification of these routes, the volume they carry, the relative impact that facility has on the motoring public. So if you're talking a high volume, high speed, high functional classification road like an interstate, particularly a large river crossing, and the impact that has on the region, the nation, the economy, and then the users. It's all factored in there. So yeah, interstates are just naturally going to rise to the top of that bucket because of the impact they have on the greatest amount of the function of the region and the nation. So, and then OP&P can dive into some of the other questions that Tara raised. But yes, I think you're generally correct.
I mean, I think you guys pretty much covered it. Local system's a lot more just complex in general. The state only controls a portion of it. So there's a lot of working with different partners and getting funding together. I think that's not to say that the goal isn't to get them close to where interstates are. I think we're pretty happy where the interstate system is now, and we like to see everything hit that mark. But like everything, it takes time.
Yep. Scott.
Just from for my own edification too, and more of a question for IDOT, at least in McHenry, 95% plus of the NH system are state routes, right? Only about 5% or less are county routes, right? We have some non-interstate NHS systems under our jurisdiction, but I think it's important, maybe this is a future topic for the committee. It's not like the counties are getting NHPP funds or any type of federal funding to maintain those NHS routes that are under our jurisdiction that IDOT has access to. So I think that's something maybe locals could look into, is how can we share in the funding that IDOT gets to maintain our NHS routes to the high condition that IDOT strives to as well. So just food for thought, maybe for a future topic that we can talk about.
And I have the number, between 80 and 85% of both bridges and pavement are state owned. So the other 15% about are non-state maintained or owned on the NHS.
Okay, that's a good discussion on that, though. Thanks for bringing that up, Tom. Good clarification. Any other comments or questions? Reeling us back in, we have a motion, a second on this item. We'll vote on in a second, and then Martin had a couple more slides for us. So seeing none, nothing else. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
So we started to get into a few of these, but we are thinking about our next long-range plan and system preservation and asset condition, not just bridges and pavement, but railroad ties and train doors and buses. In general, asset condition is really important to this region with an aging system, as we talked about. And we're just trying to think about what are our strategies that we're going to focus on for research, preparing for the next plan, fishing for a few ideas to get us started. And then we'll come back later, and this isn't your last sort of bite at this apple. But we talked about how there are new sort of improved data in certain areas and new asset management systems. Curious if any of you have seen those impact how you're programming. And I'll just go through each of these questions, give you a minute to think about them. How is sort of new data influencing how we make decisions in the system? Second, what can CMAP do to support the work you're doing? We know it's a big part of what you do every day. We've developed some asset management plans and integrated some of this data into our project selection. What else can CMAP be doing to help you achieve this work? When we develop our targets, we spend a lot of time thinking about the percent in poor condition, and really our targets for percent good are just a function of how much we move the percent poor. That seems to be how many people talk about these things, but is there sort of some different goal for percent good and poor that shouldn't be quite so closely linked? And then finally, IDOT has generously offered to help us model out into the future with their new asset management tool, different scenarios. So if you've seen any of our pavement plans, we look at different funding levels and different asset condition targets. Curious if you have thoughts on what sort of scenarios we should be working with IDOT on to bring to you. But in addition, so that's the highway side, we are working with the RTA. They are updating their cost tool that does sort of a similar activity, helps us think about maintaining the system in current condition versus improving it, and the different financial levers and implications that we might have there. That's to say, all of these targets, in our mind, feed into our financial plan that impacts fiscal constraint and things like that. So we're working on the strategy around that. And I'll pause for a second, see if anybody has thoughts.
All right, I just have a couple of questions. I can get things started here. On the question 2 there, the system preservation. I know that through your LTA program, back on the pavement preservation side of things, you guys are doing a lot to kind of help getting the local agencies involved, local municipalities and townships and those. I mean, I did a lot of pavement preservation at Lake County in my previous roles and stuff like that too, and we've seen a huge benefit from that. So I think anything you can do to try to help continue to incentivize or to get local municipalities and agencies on boards, to our comments and discussion earlier, the NHS system is kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more volume of roads that aren't getting captured, but I think that would be helpful. And it's just, to the benefits of pavement preservation and this asset management, just kind of trying to sell it, I guess, lack of a better term, to some of those local agencies would be good. And then I don't know if this is the discussion, the place or not for it, but I mean, just to your point on the bridges, right, and those aging bridges, concerning is a strong word, but I mean, there's a lot of bridges there that are due for replacement. And, does the region have the funding to address those and before they become major issues, right? Or not? So maybe that's the discussion at some point, where it bakes into. I don't know, but that's, got bridges that are 50, 60, 70 years old and need to address those somehow. So a couple comments from me. Anyone else? Any questions, comments, discussion? Yes, Tom.
Can you hear me? Sorry. I can draw on my experience at NCT COG in Dallas-Fort Worth. 2 things the MPO perhaps could do. One is to fund and support and even procure and manage some technologies, emerging technologies that assist in asset management. There's a lot of work being done with roadway video and machine learning to harvest roadway video and actually give you more situational awareness about your roadways. That'd be one. And 2, CMAP might be the procuring agent for one or more of the services that then locals could tap into. So you use the market power of CMAP procuring asset management services, from one or more vendors, and then allow the locals to basically order off what they need, those contracts. So you get the market power of the MPO, and you make it easy so the locals don't have to each procure their own asset management tools. So those would be 2 recommendations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah.
So thank you for your presentation, Martin. The first question, I'm showing my age, but does anyone else remember when there was this new thing called GIS, right? And it was going to change everything. And it continues to become more and more involved in the evaluation and the programming decisions we make, right? So the system preservation efforts is an interesting topic for 2 reasons. Number one is, as Kevin pointed out, it increases the serviceability of our assets. It increases that service life. However, for the most part, I believe most MPOs, you can't use federal money for preservation. Most MPOs, you could do LAFOs, but I don't think any council mayors does LAFOs anymore. So this is an area where you're using local funding for preservation efforts. Where is that pool of funding coming from? Because this body oversees the TIP and federal money, which is generally, I don't think, going for preservation efforts. And you probably didn't use that in Lake County when you were doing that preservation program. So just something to consider when we look at that you get the most bang for your buck, but it's the local dollar that's being used. Thank you.
Great. So I think we'll continue to ask these questions and come back to you with more data in the future. But if you want to go to the next slide, I just have a quick update. I mentioned to you in August that we are developing this dashboard. It's got our federal performance measure data on it. It's really a data-driven tool. In the past, this has been a PDF that's updated once every 4 years. Now there's some interactive maps. This is available to anyone that knows to click a link in the last paragraph of a TC memo. which is to say we're not putting it on our social media yet. We're interested in any comments or concerns that you have. Share it within your agency and let us know. But we're happy to say that it's live. So, and with that, next steps, we'll be taking this to MPO in January. Next slide, there we go. And coming back to you in the spring or summer to talk about some of our scenario modeling that we've done around this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Martin. That's a lot of good information. We appreciate the presentation. Informational items, item 6.01. Ryan is here today to provide us an update on the regional transportation plan. Good morning, Ryan.
Good morning. My name is Ryan Tomto. I'm a principal policy analyst here at CMAP. I use he, him pronouns. And as Kevin mentioned, I'm here to provide an update on the regional transportation plan. So on the next slide, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this graphic by this point, but it shows the overall process to develop the RTP. It's guided by three primary questions. What is the transportation system we want? What are the challenges and opportunities to get there? And how will we actually achieve it? So we have work underway in all of these categories. Within that first kind of track at the top for the first question, this is what we've been referring to as our emerging priorities space. We've been doing a lot of research, a lot of conversations throughout the region, just trying to get an idea of what's top of mind for folks. What are the main issues and goals that we have for the region? And so we'll be coming back to present on kind of our initial findings on that later in the springtime. But that will really be a place where we finalize those overarching goals and objectives that will then be digging into the strategies later in 2025. And as Martin was just up here presenting, this kind of stream of work also includes those performance measures and targets, particularly along the regional transportation system, which is the NHS and the regional fixed guideway transit system. In terms of what are the challenges and opportunities to get there tracked, we also have this work underway. Existing conditions is well underway. We will be coming to report on that later in, I believe, March or April of next year. And that'll be based off of what we've seen in the goals and kind of emerging priorities area. What are the existing conditions that we're seeing in those spaces? A couple of things to note on this too. We've had presentations in the past on the socioeconomic forecast. For this plan, we are maintaining the 2050 horizon year. So what that means is when we're doing the socioeconomic forecast, when we're incorporating that information in the travel demand model, we are doing the forecast to 2050. And so that is helping us understand, what are we anticipating in terms of population and employment, so that we can help make sure we have a transportation system that can address those needs. So really though, for the purposes of today's meeting, I'm really going to be getting into the third line of work here of how we're actually going to achieve it. This might seem like it's further out, but we have a lot of prep work to make sure we're well positioned to dig into this later next year. And so we previously presented on the financial plan, but today, and I think I have an animation built into the slide, but if you click next, yeah, we're going to be focused today on that capital investment section. And so this is where we're going to talk about the work that we've had underway on regionally significant projects and updates we're hoping to make to that process. And so the next slide. Again, this is the stream of work that's really about how do we identify, assess, and prioritize investments over that plan horizon. Again, thinking from here to 2050. And want to just mention too that one of the reasons why we wanted to keep it at 2050 is because at federal requirements, we need to look at least 20 years out. The way the cadence we had it, we kept adding 2 years to it because we were doing a big update every 8 years. But advancing 10 years in terms of our forecast. So the further out you get, the less realistic that forecast is, the trickier it gets, and the harder it kind of can inflate a lot of things that we're making broad assumptions that really, start to feel uncomfortable with the further that horizon year gets out. So that's why for this RTP, we'll be keeping it at the 2050 level, which still keeps us within that 20-year horizon that's required. But so on the next slide, want to just take a minute here to just talk about the purpose of this part of the work. Why do we actually do this? identification, assessment, and prioritization of capital projects within the plan. And so there's a whole lot of reasons here. Most of them are grounded in federal and state regulations. But at a very high level, the point of this work, and again, I apologize because I know many of you are on a resource group that has been helping to inform this, so a lot of this is going to be duplicative of what you've already heard, but wanted to make sure we were bringing it to this committee to provide an update. So in general, the overarching purpose of this work is to be able to look at that plan horizon 2050, look at the planning work happening throughout the region, and get an understanding of what are the capital projects that we have planned between now and 2050. What does that look like in terms of their individual impacts as well as their collective impacts? Federal regulations have requirements around things like air quality and equity and physical constraint that we have to look at specifically, but we also take it as an opportunity to look at our other goal areas around things like safety and resilience and economy and things like that. So as we take in the projects, the idea is we need to cast a wide enough net to look at the projects that have an impact on the regional system and on their adjacent communities, as well as incorporate that into, have an understanding of their impacts, and then incorporate it into a performance-based planning approach. So again, looking back to the presentation that Martin just had, we have federally required performance measures, but then we also have performance measures that we just adopt and track ourselves to better understand the system. And this is meant to be a way to understand for that regional system, again, the NHS and the fixed Guideway Regional Transit Network, how are the projects that are planned between now and 2050 going to impact those performance measures? It also allows us an opportunity to prioritize regional needs. This is more specific to our state regulations. In there, it calls for CMAP to have a role in helping to say which of the projects that are being planned between now and then are a priority in terms of helping to achieve those regional goals that we've identified. The requirements also address the fiscal constraint. We have to make sure that the RTP is realistic, that we can actually anticipate or reasonably anticipate that there will be funding available for the projects that we have included. And this is really meant to help with that prioritization effort. If we don't have unlimited funds, and so we need to make sure we're putting our best priorities forward. It also, because of that, is what allows us access to those federal funding opportunities. Going through this and doing this process is what gives us access to those federal funds. It also provides us an opportunity to advocate for new resources when we need them. I know one of the things we've been hearing about, especially in the conversation around state of good repair and system preservation, is that idea that there's not a lot of federal funding out there for those specific activities. I know in the IIJA Priority Project booklet space, we've talked a lot about bridges and how there isn't a dedicated funding source for preserving the numerous transit bridges, rail bridges that we have throughout the region. So this is a way for us to have a better understanding of what that need is and and when we're looking to address that gap, what would it take to actually make that happen? And then that we can use that data to make a more solid case to our other partners to say, hey, this is what we need to actually make this happen. Please help us out. This is, again, also an opportunity to coordinate across local and state plans. The transportation system crosses boundaries between all these jurisdictions. So this is a good space for us all to get together and look at what we all have planned and how this is all going to work and be an opportunity to collaborate more deeply. And so again, it helps to facilitate that interagency and stakeholder collaboration, as well as provide an opportunity for greater public transparency and accountability. So that we have spaces like this that are public meetings where we can talk about what this system that we have planned looks like and what we want to do to achieve it. And that kind of just wraps it up again. Sprinkled through all this are those basic meeting of state and federal requirements. But really, I think most of these things too is like, even though they are required, they're required for a good reason. These are good things for us to be doing as a region. So going to the next slide, want to just take a moment to recap where we're at in this specific line of work. So on the next slide, I have kind of an overview of this. We kicked off the project well over a year ago, where we just did some basic foundational research. Wanted to better understand the regional context. What is the history? How has this process evolved from Go to 2040 to On to 2050? looking to understand feedback we've received from our state and federal partners, as well as the peer scan of our similar MPOs to understand how they address this process and see if there's any best practices that we could learn from. And then from there, we convened a resource group, which again, thank you. Many of you have been serving on. Very grateful for your continued participation in that space. And through there, we kind of shared out some of the research that we had and then looked at some ideas of what are potential process improvements we could make. And with that, we did an analysis where we kind of assessed these different options to look to see if we're looking, essentially using tip data to answer the question of if we had made these different changes in Onto 2050, how would that have changed the project mix between then and now? To get an understanding of if we make these changes, what do we think that's actually going to mean in terms of the number of projects or the type of projects we would see come in. And so the next few slides are really kind of digging into a few of these things just to provide some more background information. So for Go to 2040, during that point, projects that were identified in the plan were referred to as major capital projects. You can see the definition here. Those were large projects with a significant effect on the capacity of the region's transportation system, including extensions or additional lanes on the interstate system, entirely new expressways, or similar changes to the passenger rail system. And so then on the next slide, you can see every 4 years we have a federal certification review. This is where FTA and FHWA come in. They work with CMAP and with RTA and other partners to assess how well are we conducting the regional transportation planning process. Are we adhering to those federal requirements? And so they provide, through that assessment, they provide the certification review. Again, this is getting back to that, being able to have access to the money. This is the certification that says like, oh yeah, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, so you can continue to have that access. And so in 2014, there was a recommendation. So it wasn't a finding, it was a recommendation, but that's saying that it is proposed that the plan identify major capital projects based on transportation community impact rather than scope. So here, the primary idea was that the threshold was very high and was kind of more focused on just big ticket roadway projects, in that there were things like, specifically it talked about things like bus rapid transit or other priorities that weren't being captured by that definition. So they're recommending that CMAP go and revisit that definition and see if there's ways to make sure that those other regional priorities had a way to make their way into the plan. So that will bring us to 2050, in the Onto 2050 plan. There, the term that was used to for projects that were identified to be included in the plan were renamed to regionally significant projects. And so with this, the thresholds, the definition and thresholds changed. It created a capacity definition. So for any projects that were impacting capacity of $100 million or more, then that would be eligible to be an RSP. Or for state of good repair, system preservation projects, it was $250 million and above. And so again, on the next slide, we had our next CERT review. So in 2022, in that there was a recommendation that we again revisit the threshold criteria for RSPs. In this instance, though, it came that with the change definition, there were a lot of projects being included on the constrained plan that they were now saying, like, is this actually a priority for the region? It might have been including some things that might not be considered a priority. And so I think this is an important point to note, that the way we have done this with Go to 2040 and Onto 2050 is that it was that the project prioritization process has been you're either on the constrained list or you're not, which we would refer to the unconstrained list. And so if you're on the constrained list, then you're considered a priority and you're an RSP. And if not, then that is saying, hey, this is something we could do, but we need more funding to be able to make it happen, to be able to shift you over onto the constrained list. And so as we move into this coming process, we're kind of like looking at all of this feedback in research to try to help think through what are some options for how we could improve the process. So on the next slide, Again, wanted to just come back to this because this is going to be a really important part of this. For those federal requirements that I were talking about earlier, really there's these four categories that are really specific to this, this element of the RTP development process. We have a whole separate memo that we developed. I can't remember the length. It's like 17 pages. It's ridiculous. Didn't want to put it into your packet because it's a lot, but it is on our website. It's on the RSP resource group site that is online and available to the public. But it outlines much more deeply what these specific requirements are that exist at both the state and federal level for this process. And so, but really it does, you can kind of like summarize it with these four categories. One, the Clean Air Act requirements. At the beginning, we had John up here talking about the air quality conformity. This is tied to that. There are requirements that are both required of the long range plan, so the RTP, as well as the TIP in the short range plan. And so there's federal regulations that outline the requirements for both of those things. There's also our Title VI and environmental justice responsibilities that are outlined there. This is in terms of making sure that through this process, we can't be exacerbating existing disparities. And so that's something we have to consider throughout all this and make sure we have a process that allows us to do that. And then it also is the performance-based planning piece of it. So again, pointing back to Martin's presentation, we have federally required measures. We have to track progress on that. We have to set targets to where we want to be. And then the planning process has to be able to show how are we actually trying, what is our plan to actually try to achieve that target? So we have to do some assessments to understand that as well through this. And throughout all of this, we have to, again, make sure we're fiscally constrained. We have to make sure that we're doing the best we can to understand what the anticipated revenues will be and work within that in terms of a fiscally reasonable, realistic plan. So to the next slide. This is also, we're going to be talking about the name, so I wanted to have this slide up here real quick too. This is where some of the confusion came into play because when we renamed the projects from major capital projects to regionally significant projects, there were instances where some implementers were getting confused because there's a federal definition for regionally significant project, which is tied to the air quality requirements piece of it. And then there's our definition. And while there's overlap between the two things, they're not a pure, overlap. There's some where we have projects that we define as RSPs that meet both definitions, but then some that do not meet both definitions. And so if you're going through the NEPA process, the forms are going to be pointing to the federal definition, not to ours. But there might be a state of good repair project that doesn't fall under this definition, but that we call an RSP. But then they're seeing in the federal, you're seeing this, are you an RSP? And it's like, yeah, I am. But anyway, it was leading to some confusion in some instances. And so that was something we were thinking about too, is potentially the need to either make sure that there was a pure overlap between the definitions or rename what we call it so that we can get rid of that confusion. So the next slide. So as I mentioned, we convened this resource group. And the first meeting was back in January. So we've been a solid year now, have met a total of 6 times, but initially in the first few meetings, we brought all that research that we did and that context setting to the resource group to kind of talk through it together. And wanted to surface what were the things that mattered most to the resource group? What are the things we should be thinking about as we're considering these different options? And so there's a list of those considerations here. I'll touch on them briefly. I think a lot of them are self-explanatory, but an idea had come up from a few of the members about this idea of could we point to plans where projects have been identified and say that those projects are automatically RSPs? So this could be things like, the idea was like, we have like safety action plans happening, or we have the transportation resilience improvement plan, or, we have climate action plan work happening where things that could be generating project ideas, could we just point to those plans and use that as a way, as kind of like a pipeline to this process? Largely, it's an idea that I think still has a lot of merit, but most of those plans aren't in alignment with the RTP's timeline for at least for this process. Those projects won't actually be identified in time to go through this process. So for now, we've kind of put that idea in the metaphorical bike rack. But Additionally, we heard about that, again, it's kind of this regional goals should really be driving the definition threshold. What are the kind of projects that are helping us achieve those goals? Making sure we're casting a net wide enough to be able to identify them. Another idea too was just that it's really easy to get caught up in the like big projects have the big impact, but a reminder that in many instances, several smaller projects can also achieve big impact. So is there a way to be thinking about that in this process? But at the same time, being mindful of this administrative burden, because whatever we do that expands the process or makes it have more, something that results in more projects being considered means more staff time from our implementing partners who have to submit that information to us, more staff time on CMAP's part to assess and analyze that information. So definitely a consideration that we've been thinking about, as well as geographic balance. We have different needs all throughout the region. There's different contexts. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of solution. So how do we have a definition that provides that geographic representation and ensures that we have a project list that helps represent those different contexts throughout the region? Again, project cost. A part of this is like having an understanding of kind of the cost benefit of this project. Might be, really expensive projects might provide a lot of benefits, but how does that balance out in terms of cost benefit ratio? And then lastly, one of the primary pieces of feedback that we had received was just this idea of being careful about the idea that if we add a bunch more projects, that it makes it harder to identify what the actual priorities are. Again, so like in the context of Onto 2050, you're either on the list or you're not. And if we make that list bigger, it just becomes more difficult to identify what the priorities are. So that was the initial feedback we got from the resource group. And so on the next slide, using that, again, we went through that scenario analysis. We looked at a bunch of different options of like, what happens if we did this or what happens if we did that, to kind of understand what that would have meant for Onto 2050 project list. And based off of that, we came back to the resource group, talked about those ideas, and had a lot of conversations, both in the resource group space as well as offline and more one-on-one conversations, especially with RTA and transit boards and with IDOT. So one of the things that we're currently considering, again, this is kind of just more of an update, so nothing has been decided yet at this point. But one of the things has been that we need to probably rethink the name just to try to reduce the confusion. And so we had considered the idea of just going back to major capital projects because that's what we called it before. So let's go back to doing that. There were concerns from some of our partners about how major, again, was getting back to that cost element and that like expensive means more of a priority, and they were worried about the optics of that. So we reverted back to that peer scan that I had mentioned, where we had looked at a lot of our fellow MPOs and what do they call their project lists. And there were two that kind of rose to the top. One was just, the most common is just calling it the RTP project list, which is pretty straight to the point. But the other most prevalent one was calling them regional capital projects, or RCPs. We are kind of leaning more towards the regional capital projects just because that rolls off the tongue a little bit easier, and RCPs is close enough to RSPs that, again, it's not too confusing. I'm hoping I don't have to go around and keep referring to the RTP project list everywhere I go. But again, if we wanted that, that's an option too. But so that's one consideration underway right now. On the next slide, this is really getting to the meat of it. We're considering changes to the definition and thresholds. And so the biggest change here is really in that first category. That's that capacity threshold. And so within this category, what you see here is basically we had a $100 million threshold for any capacity projects on the national highway system. We're basically with this removing the 100 million and saying we're moving that down to zero, and $0 becomes a dollar threshold. But then we do add a 1 center lane mile threshold onto that. And the main purpose of this is that first box is that air quality conformity requirements that come out of the Clean Air Act. And so that puts us being in alignment with that RSP definition that I had up on the screen earlier. That is what the federal definition of an RSP is that first box. And so we've had a lot of conversations. I have slides coming up where we've added a few additional kind of clarifications within this that are minor, but noteworthy still. So we'll get to them in a minute. But before we do, I want to just touch on the other ones. Another significant change that we're considering right now is in that financial box. Previously, this was like the system preservation, like state of good repair, $250 million threshold. What we're considering right now is not just making it state of good repair, but if it's any type of project that's a surface transportation project on the national highway system, this is something we would want to consider. So this could be a way, essentially what this would mean in a meaningful way is if there are, sorry, I think I said on the national highway system, but this is actually, if it's a $250 million surface transportation project in general, not outside of the regional network. So this is how you would get the the minor arterials. If you have an expensive minor arterial, we're considering that should be something that gets brought into this process just because it will be competing against our other regional priorities for those federal funds. And we want to be able to assess them and be able to think about that so that we can help communicate that more effectively, like what the priorities are. And in many situations, that minor arterial might be the priority in terms of all this, but it would give us the data and additionally, like the fiscal constraint element of this to be able to say, this is something that rises to that threshold and we've assessed it and compared it to our other priorities. And so then there's this third category, and this is a sponsored nominated category. We've had this in a way, but it's been really ill-defined in a lot of ways. Some of our CREATE projects that come in have been an example of this. But this is where we could have things that don't meet those other two definitions, but if the implementing agency in coordination with CMAP agree that this is something that should be considered through the process, we can pull it in. And so that's, again, a kind of a relief valve in a way for those projects that might not fit in, but we really want to consider in this process, either being the implementer or CMAP. And so we're thinking about this in the context of things like, this could be, significant regional bikeways and trail projects. This could be, the Illinois International Port District just completed their master plan. And there's some projects coming out of that would be competing for similar funding sources, and we might want to elevate. Similarly, things that might be coming out of CHIP or other Amtrak projects that don't neatly fit into these other categories, this could be a way for them to come in. So again, these are all being considered right now. We still have some thinking to do. And I think the next few slides will get into kind of some of the other things we're trying to flesh out before we finalize any of this. And so here on the prioritization piece of this is really getting to that concern about more projects means harder to identify what the actual priorities are for the region. And so as I mentioned, with Onto 2050, you were either in or out of the plan in terms of the constrained list. And what we're proposing is within the constrained list, actually putting a prioritization to it. So this kind of box or chart, it represents what, this is like the fiscally constrained list of projects in a hypothetical plan. And the idea here is based off of the assessment that we do through analyzing things using evaluation criteria, but then also consensus building activities in spaces like this committee. We would sort those projects into kind of tiered buckets of both an understanding of which of these are helping us to achieve our regional goals the best, and additionally, having an understanding of when we anticipate them happening, and kind of having a better idea of both the timing and priority of these projects. And so there's still details to kind of work out here, but this is the initial concept that we have in mind. And we think that this would address the issue of, even though this would be adding more projects, and it will likely, with a capacity threshold to address the air conformity requirements, result in more roadway projects that get added that might fit into FHW or the previous CERT reviews, recommendation that we try to figure out how to address those projects that might not actually be rising to the regional level, but we're still showing up in the plan. We think this is a way we could do that, because they would still be showing up in the plan, but we would be putting a greater level of prioritization to this. So when we're trying to communicate to our funding partner agencies what the priorities are for the region, like we've been doing with the IIJ priority project booklet, this would give us a better framework to be able to do that in a ongoing way. And so then almost to the last slide here, another thing we're looking at, this is my second favorite MPO named MPO is the Denver Regional Council of Governments, or DRCOG. They have developed this framework of how you different levels of modification for modifying the plan. So right now, our main way of doing it is either you don't rise to the level of an RSP, so you don't require a plan amendment. So it's either like a plan amendment or it's handled in the tip right now. By adding some of these smaller projects in, there's a risk. We don't want to have something that's like a smaller project and creating this like complex bureaucratic process that they have to navigate that slows everything down when it's just not warranted to do that. And so what we're doing right now is looking at a process like what DRCOG has that clearly articulates, if you're this kind of a project, you don't have to do that major plan amendment to make the modification. This can be handled at like a staff level or just by approval of a committee like this committee, and really making it clear that it's only those projects that are really impacting either fiscal constraint or air quality conformity that would rise to the level of a plan amendment that would need to go to the board and go through that complex process. And so that's, again, one of the things we're trying to flesh out right now is what is a similar thing that we could develop for our context to meet that need. And that would help address that administrative burden element of this, we think. And so that is anticipated to be the conversation that we come back to with the resource group next. We'll be coming back with more conversation around evaluation criteria, but then following up with having these prioritization framework and administrative procedures fleshed out better as well. And so I think, yeah, so I wanted to touch on a little bit of the feedback received real quick. And this will be new to a lot of the resource group members as well, because most of this feedback was received in offline conversations. So this is where I just want to be able to like address that feedback and then also provide those clarifications that I mentioned earlier. So the first one was just like the idea that increasing the number of projects being submitted, evaluated, and financially constrained could pose that additional burden on implementing agencies. Again, that's what I'm hoping those administrative procedures and prioritization process, getting that fleshed out, I think will address this concern, but we'll be circling back with the resource group to see how well they think it is. And that's, yeah, what we have here. But the reminder here being that, again, those increase in project numbers are coming out of conforming with or complying with the requirements from the Clean Air Act. So it's hard to say we're not going to do that because it's what's federally required of us to do. So, but really want to make sure we're being really intentional about trying to address that administrative burden piece of it, as well as making sure that we have a robust prioritization process. So we're making clear what the regional priorities are in the plan. On the next slide, additional feedback. Again, it's at additional steps for smaller scale projects that tend to have shorter project timelines. Examples of this, there's some smaller capacity expansion projects that still meet those Clean Air Act requirements, but might be moving on or still meet the threshold required under the Clean Air Act requirements, but might not warrant, if they need to make a change, again, this is getting to that, if we could have administrative procedures that don't require a full plan amendment, then we can probably address this concern without creating too much complexity for those partners. And then on the third feedback, we have that the new evaluation and prioritization process has not yet been fully defined. So this feedback was more around the idea of this hope that we can have all of the policies and procedures finalized, or that we make sure we have the evaluation criteria ready to go at the same time as that, as these other procedures. And so I think we're trying to do our best to have those aligned. I think the one piece of this that gets difficult is one of the things we're trying to consider later this summer is to use the transportation project analysis tool that CMAP has developed. We gave a presentation of this at the resource group meeting, but basically this is a tool that allows us to take multiple criteria and understand how, if we weighted those criteria differently, how that would change the weighting of the project prioritization. And so what we were really hoping that we can do is that we can identify what the evaluation criteria are for the process. Again, that criteria is aligned with those regional goals identified for the RTP. And using that TPAT tool being redundant there, but using TPAT, we then could look at different scenarios of like, okay, if we really want to lean into safety more than other measures, this is what it would look like. Or if we wanted to lean into greenhouse gas emissions reduction, this is what it would look like. And this will give us a way to kind of see different types of weighting and what the impact would be to the prioritization. And so that part, we need to have the projects identified and included before we can do that process. And so to know what projects to select, we have to have the definition and thresholds established. So that's one of the factors we're still at play with here. We should have a better idea though, when we come back in late January, early February of the exact timeline of all of this, and hopefully have a lot more of this fleshed out at that point. But that'll be a big topic of conversation at the next resource group meeting. And so finally, thank you for bearing with me. Some just additional clarifications from those conversations that we had. We wanted to make sure that it was very clear that when we talk about in the definition that you have in greater detail in your memo packet, the network connections that are referred to in there mean network connections between the regional transportation system. So we're not talking about if a driveway is being added to a project. That is not the type of connection we're talking about. We're talking about like interchanges and things like that. So that was a concern that had come up through those conversations, was like, if driveways are being added to an area, is that a new connection that would then meet this threshold? This is meant to clarify that no, that is not what we're looking for. Also, a clarification that acceleration and deceleration lanes are not a part of the RCP definition threshold. So even if you're adding more pavement because you're like extending an acceleration lane or deceleration lane, that's not subject to the Clean Air Act requirements. That's what we're looking to. And you'll notice that's in Appendix C of the memo. There's the outlines exactly what are exempt and not exempt from the Clean Air Act requirements in that appendix. And so that's what we're going off of. And so we made sure in our definition, we clarified that those acceleration and deceleration lanes are excluded. And then finally, there was a question or feedback we had received were about ideas of where, if IDOT is coming through and doing, repaving a segment of roadway, and the municipality is hoping to try to do some repainting, and just like a repainting, but to do a road diet, just through trying to latch on to an existing project. We don't want to slow that down. We don't want to create too much bureaucracy around that. And so, and it's not in the spirit of what in our opinion, not in the spirit of what we think the federal regulations are requiring of us. And so we're also proposing to add for the road diet component of the definition. So this is like, because the capacity definition is about you are impacting capacity either up or down. And so when you're reducing lanes, removing capacity, we're proposing that as long as the traffic, that we would only consider projects that are above 25,000 annual average daily traffic, or AADT, to have to go through this process. This is a threshold. We got that number from FHWA's guidance on thresholds for when lane or road diets should be considered on the NHS. And this is the threshold there. I know IDOT has a separate threshold that is lower, same with CDOT and others. But we figured if we went with the highest number that was in the guidance from FHWA, then we're capturing everybody else's thresholds. So we should be covered that way then. And so, yeah, wanted to make sure we provided those clarifications and that has been updated in the more detailed definition and thresholds that we're considering right now. And so then in terms of next steps, we're continuing to refine the definition and thresholds. I'm hoping to come back with something in early next year to the resource group. But in the meantime, we will be starting to collect project information. So we'll be reaching out to our implementing partners early next year as well to start getting that information, because it's a very time-intensive process to not only collect the information, but then to put it into our model and get everything, do everything we need to do to be able to provide the data. So we need to get on that soon so that we can make sure we have it done in time for the plan. But then we'll also be working with the resource group to finalize evaluation criteria and then actually do that evaluation. And then, as you can see, the weighting criteria piece of this, that's the scenarios I was talking about where we use TPAT to kind of look at different options for how we might weight the evaluation criteria. And then that will lead into the consensus building around that final prioritized list of projects that gets included in the final plan, with the hope that we'll be bringing that to initial consideration to the board and MPO at their joint meeting in October of next year, but then getting final approval of it later in 2026. And that brings me to the end. Any questions or additional feedback?
All right, thanks, Ryan. And for those playing word bingo, we have Dr. Cog, and I think it was Baby Boomer Bridges or something that Martin had today. So, no, good stuff. I appreciate the time, and it's very thorough. A lot of good information on that. Any questions or discussion items for Ryan? Yes, Kyle.
I think the data in the memo on how the thresholds would change the number of projects evaluated is interesting in the different categories. So it seems like the biggest difference would be more roadway capacity projects, specifically more arterial capacity projects are added to the list. So I mean, what do you think that accomplishes? Like, what is the result of more arterial capacity projects being included?
Yeah, so that, and again, it comes back to those Clean Air Act requirements, but it, in my opinion, it's larger than that, because like that is why it's in the federal regulations. But what it really allows us to do, and really the spirit of those federal regulations, is the point of it is to be able to cast a net that we can collect the project information for the projects that are likely to have impacts, and then assess them on those impacts, both individually, but also collectively, because as we've talked about, there are that on their own, it might not seem significant, but when we're talking about planning for 2050, and we are looking at the amount of expansion happening on the regional system, we want to have an understanding of what that means and what that means in terms of some of our priorities. I know in the Onto 2050 plan, I try to reference this quote all the time and I never bring it with me, so I never cite it perfectly right. But it was essentially talking about how while our population and employment was largely stagnant over the past 20 years leading up to Onto 2050, the roadway network expanded by a certain percent. I can't remember what the exact percent was, but what the point of it in there was that because of that, it resulted in the additional system preservation costs that get added in, but additionally, the region had expanded beyond, or the amount of the region that could be accessed by transit decreased, even though, yeah, like, so there was like the correlation of, we saw roadway expansion, but we didn't see the equivalent transit expansion. And so therefore less jobs and less homes were accessible by transit because of that. And so this is like the spirit of the Clean Air Act type of thing, right? It's that idea of like, we need to get an understanding of what does this all mean? If this all gets built, what does this mean for a region? And is that what we want? And do we need to do something to adjust accordingly? Whether it's like, in this case, maybe it means we need to be thinking about transit differently, and like, how are we making sure that these parts of the region where we anticipate this expansion happening don't lose access or become less accessible by other modal options.
Yeah, I think that category of projects is really critical. Those major arterial projects, and they are worthy of greater scrutiny. So it'll be interesting to see how they're evaluated in the context of the prioritization process. Especially, this committee has talked about the safety impacts, right, and a disproportionate amount of serious injuries and fatalities, vulnerable people walking and biking on these corridors. And then from a transit perspective, these arterials are often home to some of the busiest transit routes in the city and the suburbs. So are we taking advantage of opportunities to um, deliver greater bus priority on these corridors, which has been a regional priority of ours, but something where we're trailing peer regions, right? So just moving forward, I hope we have more discussion about, if more arterial projects are going to be included on the list, how are they going to be evaluated? How are they going to be prioritized? And how do they impact these key regional goals that we have?
And I think an important point too, like I'm citing transit, but on another end of it too, these roads and oftentimes are very critical to freight movement. And so it helps us get a better understanding of like, we can understand of those as we're assessing them. Again, Clean Air Act requirements are pointing to air quality, but we also have freight goals. And this will help us better understand which of these projects are really helping us in the freight area and which ones might not be as more, focused on freight. And so it just helps give us a better picture of what is planned between now and 2050.
Thanks, Kyle. Anyone else? Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I have a question, and thank you for the presentation. And I know that your team has taken a lot of feedback offline from a number of us, so appreciate that. I'm interested in sort of the interplay between the thresholds and this evaluation process and sort of how it potentially plays out if the evaluation process sort of reveals that the broadening of the list has unintended consequences. Like it sounds like we haven't yet, finalized the thresholds, but then we're going to go into a process of determining what the prioritization and evaluation criteria might be. What will it look like to get to a finalization of thresholds and a finalization of criteria as you all look at those scenarios?
Yeah. So in terms of timeline, we are looking to I believe the next resource group is planned to happen in early February. And so that is where we're going to be coming back to talk about the evaluation criteria more and try to finalize that, as well as having a better idea of what the more fleshed out administrative procedures are and that prioritization process would look like. So that would help us understand, based off of a more expansive definition and thresholds, what the implications of that might be. In terms of the evaluation criteria, I think that the process, again, it gets to the piece of the first step is defining what the criteria are and like establishing here are the criteria that align with our goals. And this is the best way to measure this. Like we have the data to do it, or that it's realistically feasible to do that kind of analysis of it. So that's the first step of it. But then the second step really gets to the weighting part of it. And like, are there criteria that we want to consider or weight more than others, which again, going back to that peer analysis that we did, is the best practice among most of our peers. And so we've really been wanting to look to how we could be thinking about that criteria. And really for that part of it though, that's the part that gets really difficult to do, because we can't actually do the weighting exercise without knowing what the projects are, like having the projects actually evaluated and scored to be able to then start weighting them and seeing what it looks like based on that. We have considered ideas around like, what if we did it to onto 2050 projects and didn't exercise that way. But again, because the definition was less expansive, it doesn't give us a line of sight to those smaller projects that are what we're actually really concerned about, what they mean for this process. So we actually need to like collect that project information to be able to do the analysis to know how we might want to make sure we're weighting them accordingly to really, again, the weighting is about getting to that regional significance part of it. A lot of these projects that we're going to capture are providing immense benefits to the location they're in. But when we're talking about a regional transportation plan and how are we rating or, prioritizing things at a regional scale, many of them might not rise to that level of priority, though collectively their impacts could be something that we need to have a line of sight to and think about. But we really want to have that project information included in that TPAT analysis, kind of weighting analysis, so that we actually we're being more precise than if we were just guessing.
And then it's sort of the ultimate result here is that in the diagram you showed, that sort of priority tier one will now kind of be the only projects that are deemed regionally significant as opposed to anything that is on the list.
Yeah, so we would be proposing that we would call those the priority projects for the region, and they would be elevated in the RTP as these are the big priorities. These would be the ones that we'd be working around in the IIJ priority project booklet or whatever we rename it in future years. But that would be the space where we're communicating, these are the projects that, you know, when we're talking about mega or infra or, you know, different things like that, that we are communicating very clearly in the plan and other materials that we produce, that these are the priority to achieve the vision and goals that we've established in the plan. Yeah.
Thanks, Kara. Anyone else? Yes, Steve.
Yes, Ryan, thank you again. Thank you for taking some of our comments. We do like the ADT threshold. This does, I guess, kind of cut both ways, right? When you're looking at the universe of projects, I think I'm really eager to get to the universe of projects because once you kind of define where the thresholds are, then we'll kind of see how big the list is. When it kind of cuts both ways, because now this will take a lot of local projects, you know, Kane County, 20 at Randall would now fall in this category. Where before it wasn't. And then at the same time, we're working with PACE on CMAQ, and I know CTA, CDOT, there will be certain routes as well that with that mile threshold of removing lanes. So when you look at like CMAQ and PACE, looking at possibly removing lanes on 30,000 ADT, that would hit this threshold. So certainly with the pulse routes, that I don't know how that's going to look, right? So I'm very curious once you get to the universe of projects, how big it actually gets, because it's also removing capacity, not only adding capacity. So
yeah, definitely. And I do think it would point in the memo, we have the scenario analysis of we were limited to the data that we have in the TIP. But if it's a project that exists in the TIP, then we were able to say like, oh, this isn't currently an RSP, but it would be under this scenario. And we saw that it resulted in about 30 additional projects, which would bring us up just below 100 projects total being considered. But for what it's worth, we are on the very low end when, again, going to that peer analysis. Most of our partner agencies have anywhere between 300 to 400 projects included in their plan. LA region, Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG, has over 3,000 projects that they analyze in their plan, which that is not what we're doing. But yeah, so I think that's what we've been trying to look at too, is that we are very much, as in terms of our peers, we have fewer projects than most of our peers that we look at through this process. We still will be at the low end of that, even with these changes, but really wanting to make sure we're also one of the few agencies that actually model the projects. Most of our peers don't model their projects included in the plan, other than at the end to do the air quality conformity analysis, but they don't model them individually, which is very time intensive, but provides a clear picture of the impacts. And so that's kind of how we're balancing it out. We still want to try to keep the number lower so that we can continue to model them, but also want to make sure we're meeting our air quality conformity requirements under the Clean Air Act, and as well as Title VI and the fiscal constraint and other requirements. So.
Great. All right. Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Moving on, item 7, other business. Do we have any other business that committee members would like to bring forward today? Seeing none. Item 8, public comment. Just a reminder, if you're online, please notify staff by using the raise the hand function, and then wait for staff to identify you before addressing the committee. Do we have anyone from the audience or online that would like to address the committee today?
We did receive, received a written public comment in advance of today's meeting. The comment is from John Paul Jones with Grow Greater Inglewood and Sustainable Inglewood Initiatives. Good morning, Chairman Kevin Carrier, CMAP Transportation Committee, fellow committee members, and CMAP staff. We appreciate the continual work of the Transportation Committee and its zeal to do more for the metropolitan region. We are writing today to encourage the committee and the broader unit of CMAP to be far more intentional in its quest to receive public comments on policy directives. It will be worthy of consideration to have policy directives that carry public comment period deadlines and/or simply desired public feedback to be placed on various platforms beyond the ETIP site. Far too often, the public is not fully aware that the public comment periods are open. Regarding the call for project deadlines, the minutes from the November 2024 include a mini report on the call for projects program. It is our hope to receive today a brief statement on the agencies and the types of projects entered as of December 9th. The Grow Greater Englewood community and Greater Southside are most interested in this program. It is important to note that a host of transportation-related policies were pursued in this year's City Budget Department hearings. On December 16th, the City Council approved in its program management ordinance language to create a division on policy and planning within CDOT to help sharpen and broaden its approach to transportation decision-making. Also, CDOT is currently accepting feedback and suggestions for the division policy. Grow Greater Englewood is a social service enterprise, food and land sovereignty organization working to ensure healthy and productive living in the southwest region of Chicago. Grow Greater Englewood is engaged in urban farming, open space strategies, alternative transportation planning, and recently established a community land trust organization. This week, another major federal grant was released to advance the 75th Street CREATE project. This major public investment speaks volumes on the federal government commitment to reduce freight traffic congestion in the Midwest. We would now only encourage, as part of the $1 billion CREATE project, that CMAP create a public participation platform that will formally assemble Southwest regional community stakeholders to engage and plan alongside railroad operators and transportation agencies. We would need CMAP help to introduce environmental solutions, a unified work plan, and innovations in planning via climate resiliency. Let's move as a team and not alone. This project is fast becoming a national model without a very public participation plan. Fiscal year 2025 provides that window of opportunity to plan together. To this end, thank you for your consideration and leadership. We remain committed to working with CMAP and the Transportation Committee and its executive board to improve regional coordination in transportation and equity and capital spending decision-making. Happy holidays. And that's it.
Great. Thanks for reading that, Doug. I think we have Garland online.
Yeah, we have both John Paul Jones and Garland with
Awesome.
hands raised. So you recognize whomever you.
Garland, can you hear us?
Yes. Happy holidays to you, Kevin. It's Garland Armstrong, formerly of Des Plaines and Elmwood Park, now living in Des Moines, Iowa. How's everybody doing there in the Chicagoland area?
A little snowy, but we're good. Yeah, doing well.
Well, it's a little cool here, but we had snow, but it's already melted. And as you know, my 12 more days count down to my wife's birthday, and she's the first New Year's baby born in the blizzard of 1979 in Melrose Park, and the second New Year's baby born in the Chicagoland area. So just want to give you all the heads up on that. And I have some, I have three concerns. Like, I just want to comment, feedback from like in Elmhurst one time, when people are waiting at the Elmhurst Metro station, and I know DuPage is there. Have you talked to Metro to make sure, especially if the freight train stop and then they make announcements saying which side the train's going to be on, and there's only stairs, but for those with mobility who can't cross over because of the freight train blockage, are y'all going to do like an underneath part to make it accessible, like have an elevator or a ramp there, or going overhead, because something like Lombard has? Because Elmhurst needs one too. If the unthinkable does happen, if the freight train stops and it's not moving, and it's the passenger and the commuters know which side to go on. So will DuPage County and Elmhurst and Metro work together to make it accessible, especially for those with mobility, like in power wheelchairs or wheelchairs. Make sure that they'll be able to get to that other location so their train will be right there on time waiting for them. And also too, number two, my concern is I want to make sure about especially where the buses are, especially for the grassy part, especially those waiting at the bus stop in the grassy where mobility is. I want to make sure, are they going to put a little more sidewalks in there? Because as you know, what happened when we was living there in Tinley Park, there was no, when my wife and I was getting off the Pace Bus 364 going to Trinity Lutheran Church, I had to pull her into the streets in the grassy part, going to the church there at 159th Street and Oak Park Avenue. I wanted to make sure if Pace and Cook County and Tinley Park is making sure that they're got their sidewalks up to date on it, so people with disabilities in that area can finally say it's long overdue and the time has come. And I wanted to make sure about that. And my last concern is, especially with the winter coming up, I hope want to make sure everyone is updated, especially if the unthinkable does happen with the battery operated, especially like on the Pace bus, CTA bus, or even on a Metro train, or on a CTA train. I wanted to make sure that are they updated, so if people who cannot speak clear English, especially in different languages, and those in the disability community and other non-disabled people, will they be able to be up to date on it to know what's the unthinkable and what they can do next to be well prepared, so there won't be any lawsuits coming on it and this and that. So I want to make sure what is the progress of it and what's up to date on everything. So that's all of my three concerns about, and I would like to have any comments, suggestions, or questions from any of the committees over there. And that's all I have to say.
All right, thanks, Garland. We appreciate the comments. We'll get those shared with the appropriate folks. And do us a favor and say happy birthday to Heather for us, and have a happy new year.
You too, and don't drink too much, everybody. And we want to make sure you get your energy ready for the next day, especially coming in the new year and everything else.
Thank you, Garland. Appreciate it.
All right.
John Paul, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to share very special thanks to the CMAP staff and board on the many years we've worked together on the Red Line Extension project. Currently, right now, I'm the co-chair of, co-founder of the Red Line Extension TIP Coalition, primarily reorganized to ensure that we had a local funding match from the state. And with that match, along with other matching dollars that CMAP approved through its board and committee, we are at a point now where the first funding agreement letter has been received by CTA, and there's plans now to have some kind of brief celebration soon. It's always just recognizing this as a wonderful time, and I certainly appreciate the many years that CMAP has worked alongside community stakeholders, the Far South Side, and organizations to bring us to this day. And we hope to have CMAP help us as we go through the next phase to look at cost containment and clean air compliances and a host of other kind of planning apparatuses that can ensure that we get a significant amount of private investment along that very expensive public investment project. I just want to say thank you. Look forward to working with you in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, you kind of broke up at the end there, but I think you're wrapped up. So thanks to John Paul. We appreciate the comments. Happy New Year, happy holidays, and look forward to hearing from you next year. Anyone else? Cam, is that good? Okay. Sounds like that's it. Moving on to item 9.0. Our next meeting, the committee is scheduled for February 28th of 2025. So with that, happy holidays, happy New Year, everyone. Seeing no other business before the committee, do I have a motion to adjourn? Amy, second. Lynette, awesome. All those in favor? Any opposed? Meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone.